Good evening and welcome to this pre-recorded edition of Behind the Headlines for Wednesday the 17th of August. And in this programme tonight we'll be discussing the alarming rise of Jew hatred on our university campuses, and one particular story stands out of a young Jewish girl who wrote an article or assignment in defence of Israel, and she was given a fail by university lecturers, which resulted in her failing to graduate from her university in Leeds. So we'll be asking, is academic freedom of expression under threat with the rise of Jew hatred and anti-Israel sentiment at our university campuses? And joining me tonight is my good friend Alistair Scott, the UK director of Joseph Storehouse. Great to see you, Alistair. Thank you.
Always good to see you. Good to be back with you.
And Alistair, what are your thoughts? Because on the issue of academic freedom of expression, particularly when it comes to Israel, we are increasingly seeing alarming rise of Jew hatred on university campuses. I believe that Jewish students are actually fearful to be identified as being Jewish. The university I attended, the University of Manchester, back in the 90s, had the biggest Jewish JSOC, that's the Jewish Union, now has one of the smallest in the country because of the rise of anti-Semitism on campus, the abuse that Jewish students receive, but also harassment as well, and also sometimes physical violence as well. I mean, our universities are supposed to be places of learning, to learn about the world, to have a great experience as a time before work, but also to gain a kind of specialist knowledge in a particular subject that prepares them for the rest of their life. And yet we see here that our Jewish students are facing horrendous times on campus.
Absolutely right. And as you say, back in the 90s, it's beginning, but in the last 10, 15 years, it's become so bad for the Jewish communities, because, and you know, we reach out and we talk with, we meet them at some of our meetings and so on, and a lot of the Jewish adults or semi-adults, as they're getting to adulthood, going into further studies, are not wanting to go to university, and you know, are thinking in terms of going to universities in a different nation, maybe the US or in Jerusalem or Israel, which is a terrible state of affairs, isn't it? Where we're supposed to have a freedom of religious views, a freedom of political views, freedom of expression, and yet it's become so anti-Zion, anti-Jew, anti-Semitic. So it's a very difficult time for any young person who's just wanting to further their education, get on with their lives, get on into their careers. And for the Jewish people, they are so persecuted. I mean, we've had so many issues. I was talking to you about it before the program, about a time when we were doing one of our meetings down in Exeter. And it's a very big church that reaches out to the reaches out to the university. And but they didn't have much of an understanding in Israel, so it was great to go in there with a day's seminar on Israel and God's plans for the nation. But we were taken on a tour of Exeter, and I'm talking about 6 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever it was. It was well before the pandemic started. One of our supporters lives down there, and she took us around the university campus, and there were a lot of new buildings. And she said, do you know, it's not publicized, but all of these new buildings were funded by Libya into the main university of Exeter. I mean, you know, it's one of the main universities in the west of the country. And you think, well, anyone who's investing money into the universities and our education system is doing it with an agenda.
Absolutely.
And so it's not surprising, you know, because it's not the only one. I think it's exactly the same in Nottingham, where they've had a new campus, and other places around the country where universities have been looking to update or upgrade and so on. And the funds seem to always come from the likes of the Libyas, Iran and so on, because they want to influence our education system and our higher education system. And the sad influence is it comes in totally anti-Jewish, anti-Israel. And we've heard many stories about debates where there's been a Jewish speaker and whatever speaker, the other side, and the Jewish speaker is just not even allowed to speak because they just shout it down.
I know Exeter University very well because I attended. I did my A-levels at Exeter College, which was right next door.
Oh yes, I remember you.
So I know Exeter University very, very well. A very nice campus ground, but also they've got a very strong Middle Eastern department that is known to be notoriously anti-Israel. I suppose the danger is that there is a direct correlation, isn't there, between what is taught at our universities, particularly in the kind of social sciences when it comes to Israel, and the direct consequence of anti-Israel lectures and sentiment on campus leads to, of course, sadly, Jew hatred on campus, because there's a direct correlation. And sadly, what we're seeing now, in particular times in which we're living in, is that there's only one narrative. And we're seeing that with our universities, we're seeing that in our society, that there's only one permitted narrative now. And if you don't fully 100% endorse that narrative, then you're in trouble. And of course, what we're seeing as well through our universities as well, holding kind of like annual events called Apartheid Week at universities, where Israel is accused of being an apartheid state, and they have kind of mock killings of students dressed up as Israeli soldiers, beating and shooting so-called innocent kind of Palestinians, give the impression that Israel is a brutal occupier, which is kind of further from the truth. But of course that narrative is thrown out the window because the Palestinian narrative is so popular amongst the left. This is the one that has the predominant ideology within academia. I mean, even having academics questioning whether Israel has a right to exist as a state. Now, they have a right to question Israel's right to exist, but when you do it academically, that means you also then have to question the right to exist of Saudi Arabia, Iran, the rest of the Middle East, even the United States. So where do you stop when it comes to this? And we know that Israel's has got more legal rights as a nation than the vast majority of modern nations that were created in the aftermath of the Second World War anyway. So this is a concern. But the one particular story that really grabbed my attention, Alistair, and this was a young Jewish woman called Danielle Grayman. She's 23-year-old Jewish student from the University of Leeds. She has now decided to sue Leeds University because she was given a fail in one of her sociology assignments because she did not criticise Israel. It says here as well that she wrote in her essay about the crimes committed by Hamas against the Palestinians, and saying this was a crime against the Palestinian people, and decided not to pass it because she did not pin any blame on the Jewish state. It also said that we also say that she also wasn't able to take up her place at Glasgow University to do an MA degree to further her career because she was in limbo for a complete year. So, I mean, what we're seeing really is the bias of university lecturers who coming to the fore, putting their own bigoted viewpoints forward. And because someone is having a different academic perspective, is backing up with facts, that is rubbish and gets a fail. Outrageous.
I mean, and the interesting thing with Danielle, having read about the case and done some research, she had a tremendous record of all her essays being tip-top, best marks and all the rest. And so it comes to this one, and it was the final. So it's, it's the final one before her graduation. And because she's done her arguments, she's put her reasoning, she's done everything in the right way. So, you cannot, shouldn't mark a paper according to your opinion against somebody else's. She's done everything right. And of course, she missed out, as you say, on going on to do a master's at Glasgow because it took them so long. They had the paper remarked by an adjudicator, and he gave it a pass at flying colours, but it took them so long to come to that decision. She lost her place. So it's a very sad case, but I'm sure it's not the only case, and it needs someone like Danielle now to make a point of challenging it, because a lot of people just take it and step back. But good on this young lady for actually taking these people to whatever adjudication there is in order to get some kind of compensation, because it's cost her at least a year of her life, because I guess she's got to go through the applying for a position to do the MA, and that wasn't her plan, that wasn't her reason, and it's not like she's done anything wrong, except she's put down an essay with all the right credentials, all the research, but it didn't agree with what the thinking of the marker was, and he's marked her down. So I'm hoping that this is not something that gets swept. I mean, this is why we do Behind the Headlines, because it's a story that wouldn't reach the front page of a newspaper, but it's an important thing for us to actually take on and publicize it so people actually know. And let's be praying for this young lady, that she just comes through and finishes, with a great career ahead of her, because she obviously has strong direction, and we need to encourage people of conviction, not
no, she's shown incredible bravery, incredible courage, and also now, though, because she's been so tainted by this, her whole ambition, career ambition, was to be a sociologist, but now this has completely put her off that career path because of it. We'll go into a bit more details, got some more notes on this one, but the other issue, I think, is an issue of conscience. I had a similar situation when I was at university, when I was given a title in one of my courses that in my spirit I struggled with it. So I asked the Lord, I'm struggling to write this essay. I always asked the Lord to help me to actually write an essay when I was at university, and this one I just came against a kind of brick wall. So, the week later, it was the Easter break. Didn't have to be handed in till after the Easter break. The Lord somehow miraculously got a hold of this book by David Hunt called Jerusalem, A Cup of Trembling, which was an incredible book. And I told this story to Dave Hunt himself, and he was very impressed. And so I used the evidence that he suggested, particularly when it comes to kind of terrorism against Israel, and used his arguments. And was threatened to be kicked out of my university for it. I put the evidence there, but with my conscience, I couldn't do what they asked me to do, because it went against the Holy Spirit inside of me to actually do that. So I think also that students have to really stand up and have to go with a conscience, because it would have been so much easier to say, look, I can just brush this under the carpet. I'll go along with what the lecturer wants. And I'll just submit this essay the way he wants it, get a good mark, and that's it. But in my conscience, I couldn't do that, because I knew that what I was writing was not truth, and I had to write the truth. So I did get threatened to get kicked out of university for it. Became a bit of a hero with other kind of my peers, my students, and willing to stand. But I just couldn't do it. So I had to make a stand. But I left it in God's hands, and then a year later he was dismissed as the head of his department. So and I did think I was going to get kicked out of university for it. So it's amazing how God's grace, if you stand in his strength, he can do so much. But it does go to a question that this would have caused her a lot of grief, to write something that she didn't believe in, being Jewish and being associated with the state of Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, and having to criticize Israel in order to get a good mark or a pass so she could pass a degree. I think this day and age is absolutely disgusting.
Absolutely, I agree with you so much, and great that you had that conviction in you as well, going back in the 90s. But how many students, I mean, we've taken this on in our church now to pray for those who have come through our church, have come through our youth groups, and then go to university. Because the peer pressure, and not only the peer pressure, but the pressure that's coming from the education system on them to conform. Romans 12 says, do not conform to things of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But they're going in with renewed minds, but are being almost forced into conforming to the world system. And that's why we are really taking it on. As much as we pray for our overseas workers and our missions, it's one of my roles in the church, but we are now praying for our young students going into university, because we know, just as you felt, it's probably 10 times worse than when you were there, the influence that's coming against them. So I mean, anyone who's watching the program, if you got kids or young people that that are going into university and they are strong in their faith at the moment, I know personally of people who went in strong in their faith, faith, but within a year had just fallen into the system because of the pressure that's on them. And for young Danielle, the fact that she's even thinking of the thing that really was in her heart, sociology, it was like a conscience of the thing she wanted to do to make a difference. And now she's talking around about, maybe I'm not going to do this in the future because she's taken such a snap. So she's one I'm going to be praying for. Lord, give her strength, let her be strong, and just show her that she's chosen the right path.
Amen.
And God will direct her.
Let's have a look at this excellent CBN news report. We know that this is discussing American campuses, but the same can be applied to the UK and the rest of Europe. And this is a trouble that is particularly bad for not only the Jewish community, but also for our society and our Western civilization, the rise of Jew hatred on campus.
Some folks hear about anti-Semitism here in America and they tend to blame people on the right. But often it's coming from the left, and sometimes right here on college campuses.
The truth is that anti-Semitism has been on the rise across the board. The Anti-Defamation League talks about how there's been an uptick, I think it's 57% increase, but on the university campuses, just in the last year alone, it's over 80%.
For example, UCLA is taking heat for hosting the Students for Justice in Palestine annual conference. As philanthropist Adam Milstein pointed out in a tweet, its members use words like, let's stuff some Jews in the oven, kill all the Jews, don't hesitate to slash their throats. Eliza Lewin of the Brandeis Center speaks of Jewish students afraid to wear shirts showing Hebrew.
Because when they wear Hebrew t-shirts, they feel that it makes them a target.
Being accosted by other students and calling them Zionist baby killers and that sort of thing.
Professor David Bernstein at George Mason University's law school writes about anti-Semitism. Some of it comes from Middle Eastern Muslim students now studying here.
Anti-Semitism is common and unobjectionable in the Middle East. Rates of anti-Semitism in Syria, the Palestinian territories, Jordan, Egypt are 80% plus.
And the Jews get judged for their defense of the Jewish homeland, Israel.
If you demonize Israel, if you think that Israel is so awful that it should be the one country singled out for sanctions and boycotts and all that, then you say to yourself, well, who's defending this evil country? And not surprisingly, the people who are most active in defending Israel on many campuses are Jews, so there must be something wrong with the Jews.
Lewin says people on campus who say they're just anti-Zionist, not anti-Jew, don't understand how crucial Zion is to most Jews.
The special feeling about Zion, about Israel, is an integral part of Jewish identity. It is there's a deep spiritual, religious connection to Israel that predates the creation of the modern state of Israel.
Some folks dream that things like racism and anti-Semitism may just fade away as civilization progresses. But if it's starting to bubble up on college campuses and among the young, maybe it's a dream that has to be put off for a while. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from the George Mason Law.
And a very good news report there put together by CBN that addresses the issue of anti-Semitism on campus. And Alistair, a few years ago, we made a documentary for Revelation TV called Jew Hatred, a Warning to the Nations, or along those lines. And this is when I worked with Joel. We went to Europe, we went to Paris, we went to kind of Brussels and also Israel as well. But when we were in Brussels, a kind of a filming recording, we were at one of the top universities in Belgium. And recently there was an Israeli, I think it was Israel's Minister for Education was actually speaking because they tried to ban Israeli lecturers from speaking at universities. And when I was interviewing some of the Jewish students there, they were saying about all the harassment and abuse they've got. And one guy we got on camera was saying how that one fellow student got a kind of firelighter, tried to light his shirt and said, this is what should happen to you with the rest of you that died in the gas chambers. So the level of hatred that has been directed at Jewish students on campus is frightening. Their own personal safety. Many Jewish students from Belgium in particular don't want to go to university in Belgium because they don't feel safe. They either want to go to the States or more than want to now study and get a degree in Israel because they don't feel safe anymore. And also we know that the reason why this topic and subject is so significant and so important is that university produces our next generation of leaders, whether they are leaders in government, our future prime ministers, our future ministers, journalists who then work for the major news corporations or work for our national newspapers. Those will have also those in industry and all the professions. If they are brainwashed with this hatred towards Israel, what are they going to be like when they get into positions of power and influence? They're going to hate Israel. They're going to hate the Jewish people and realize that they will end up being on the wrong side of history, make the wrong decisions because they take God out of the equation.
It's such a sad situation, and as you say, it is getting worse. I mean, watching that report from CBN there, it's talking about USA, and USA for such a long time has been the last strong bastion of support for Israel, and yet there you see that the Jewish students are being harassed and having so many anti-Semitic attacks going on there. And we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in our own country, United Kingdom, right across the attacks that go on. But in places like Belgium, yeah, I mean, I've ministered in Belgium many times. I've had prayer groups and so on, doing things there. And there are parts of Belgium that are so now controlled by Islamic mindset. But, recently there has been, within the EU particularly, there are people there who are just waking up to the danger. I mean, the EU sponsored for many, well, still do, funded, not sponsored, but funded the education in Palestine through the UN and so on. And they were teaching their kids from age 5 and upwards to hate, and not only hate, but hate to the point of desire to kill Jewish people. And that's the education system that we're funding in Europe. So something has to change, and I think there is a waking up going on within the nations, but there's so much more that needs to be done. And in the university, as you say, they're future leaders of governments, they're the future leaders of business, they're future leaders of banking. And if they're fed a lie and they believe the lie, it's going to affect the next generation even greater. So we need to be more and more aware of what's going on and really see that we get a change in the education system.
Absolutely. So going back to Danielle's essay, this is according to the Jewish Chronicle and also the Daily Mail. Her original essay referenced Hamas' use of human shields, saying it was viewed as a betrayal of the Palestinian people by their government. And what she means by human shields is using women and children literally as human shields to protect Hamas terrorists when they fire their rockets and missiles into Israel, so that they are killed by Israeli fire and you then protect the terrorists themselves, which is absolutely horrendous behaviour, but that's the asymmetrical warfare that Israel has to deal with. She also says that she also gave 8 examples of anti-Semitism being taught to children in UNRWA schools, the United Nations Work Relief Agency schools in Gaza. She said these include a teacher who venerates Hitler and others who celebrate knife attacks, kidnapping, ransoming attacks against Israelis. The Markers wrote, so 7 teachers constitutes a wave of anti-Semitism, ? This evidence is also weakened by the admission that the transmission and acceptance of those heinous ideas cannot be measured. In other words, we can't prove it. We don't know the extent of this. But I mean, anyone, and my guest for our special guest for the program will expand upon this. But don't these academics actually read anything? Haven't they actually read the Hamas Charter that calls not only for the destruction of the State of Israel, but also for genocide against every single Jewish people on the planet? And that is the Nazi-type ideology of Hamas. It's persecution against Christians in Gaza, horrific. And it's persecution against its own people as well. I mean, let's also remember that back in 2007, after the Palestinian parliamentary elections, Hamas won in Gaza, but Fatah, the ruling faction of the PLO, want to hang on power. How did Hamas take over Gaza? They carried out a coup d'etat against Fatah, and they had Fatah members thrown off the roofs of buildings, and they are their fellow Palestinians. So what does this lecture make of this?
And they never tell these stories. They never tell the truth. In any of the media situations, you've really got to dig to find out these facts. And what the girl is saying is absolutely true. We know that's what happens and then they feed off the retaliation attack, whatever you want to call it, when they're trying to take out those areas where the rockets are being fired from, and then they've always got television cameras available to show the women and children who've been killed. And that's been their plan in the first place. That's their agenda, to use it against the whole Jewish cause. As you say, I can never understand as students why you don't dig into facts. Why do you just believe what somebody puts in front of you as part of your curriculum to study and not actually check out the source, you know? Because these are the future workers, leaders, and they need to research a little bit more before they swallow the lie. But it's a Nazi plan from the 30s, wasn't it? If you tell a lie long enough, more often enough, people start to believe it's the truth. And we are challenged really as adults, as believers, as people in the media here, to actually proclaim the truth and proclaim the truth over and over again until people start to at least question, maybe I'm listening to a lie, because no one else is going to do it. It's got to come from somewhere.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at Miss Grayman's statement when she was interviewed by the Jewish Chronicle in response of getting a fail because she wrote a pro-Israel essay in her assignment at university, the University of Leeds. She wrote, "I've studied sociology since GCSE. Also, I got a GCSE, I got an A-level in sociology, and in GCSE. Said it was very much my passion. I wanted to become a sociologist. After this happened, I had an entire meltdown where I was like, my dream isn't going to happen. There's no other career that appeals to me. What I am going to do, where am I going to go? I don't think returning to sociology is an option. I can't retain in another subject. I've used my student loan. I basically wasted this time in my life. If retroactively if I'd known what I know now, I wouldn't have studied sociology. It was a field created by Jews, and now the hostility towards Jews and Jewish students is insane. It's crazy." And that's her direct response, according to the press. Now, she's been very brave. I think she's been, and Danielle would be very, very welcome to be my guest anytime on the Middle East Report, tell a story. We know it's under kind of a legal blanket at the moment, as she, with the help of others, have taken Leeds University to court over this one, and they're suing Leeds University. And it's important that other students do the same, because we have to stand up for freedom. We have to stand up for academic freedom of expression. Otherwise, we live in an authoritarian, totalitarian state. We see that in China today, we see that in Iran, and we see that across the Middle East. And our universities should be places of learning. They should be places of, academic freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, because, this is what we've inherited. But it seems like this generation, we're beginning to lose those freedoms.
Yeah, well, I'd say to this young lady, Danielle, don't give up on your dream. The chances of you watching this program are probably not very high, but spiritually, I would just say, don't give up on your dream. We need people like you of conviction to stand up, because otherwise we're just being, as Simon just said, we're being controlled by a system which is not right. It's not righteous, and it's proclaiming a lie. It's got an agenda. So Danielle and any others like you, don't give up on your dream, even if you take the odd setback. You come on, keep fighting, and come through and do what I believe is what the Lord has put in your heart to do. Sometimes we don't acknowledge it, but I believe you've been chosen for times such as this, like an Esther. So Danielle, continue to follow your dream and see it to its fulfillment.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this old CBN news report, but a very important one. It's called "Online University Confronts Anti-Israel Bias with the Truth." And of course, there's also good organisations like Stand With Us that equip students with the knowledge about Israel and the Jewish people.
Major universities.
Israel is under siege at American universities and at campuses around the world.
Boycott Israel! Boycott Israel! Israel really doesn't meet the requirements of a legitimate state.
Now a course from Jerusalem Online University gives students and others the tools to fight back.
So we're trying to give a perspective on not just the history of the ancient and modern state of Israel, but also on the biblical prophetic connection between the modern Jewish people and the Bible, how the ancient history connects with the modern, where it's going.
The Israel course, The Biblical, Historical, and Modern Perspective, is a 7-part movie course that condenses the history and contribution of the Jewish people.
We're dealing with such a complex situation that people tend to have very little information on. And we know the media can be very, very biased.
Rabbi Ken Spiro, one of the film's creators, says they're taking a holistic approach on politics, religion, and philosophy.
We show in one of our movies, Israel Inside. It's such a dynamic, creative, positive force in history, yet why Israel has been, the Jewish people have been the most hated people in human history.
When people think about Israel, they think about war, or religion, or even falafel.
The Israel Inside course focuses on modern Israel, its advances, and contributions to the world.
But to me, when I think about Israel, I think of the triumph of the human spirit. Israelis, surrounded by enemies, have turned a desert with hardly any natural resources into a flourishing, productive, and caring society.
Spiro presents 2 of the videos.
In recent years, the Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel has become somewhat of a contentious issue. But in fact, every year, more and more archaeology is unearthed that clearly demonstrates the Jewish people's ancient connection to the land of Israel.
One of his favorites is The Edge of History.
And that's about prophecy and the end of days. And the reason I love that material so much is, of everything I present as an educator, it's probably the most condensed. It not only gives the whole sweep of what Jewish history is about, but what it focuses on is current events, what's going on now.
The final class teaches students how to effectively stand up on behalf of Israel.
Every individual has the ability to communicate for Israel, to inspire people about Israel, and to educate people about who Israel really is.
Spiro believes using truth and little-known facts about Israel will help people make their own decisions about Israel and the Jewish people. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
A great report there put together by Chris Mitchell from CBN. Let's have a look now at an interview that I did yesterday, and this is Behind Headlines special guest talking about the rise of Jew hatred on our university campuses, but also how Israel is being marginalised. We're now joined on Behind the Headlines by Peter Bourne, who is the foreign editor of Blitz magazine, and he's also the chairman of South End Friends of Israel. Peter, warm welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much, Simon. Great and honoured to be invited back again. Thank you very much.
You're always welcome. You're always welcome, my friend. Anyway, what would you make of the news story that appeared recently, not only in the Daily Mail, but also in the Jewish Chronicle, involving this young Jewish student called Danielle Grayman, who's 23, who was failed her graduation and her essay assignment because of her pro-views on Israel?
Yeah, very interesting, this particular issue, Simon, because I was actually surprised, pleasantly surprised, I should say, at the speed with which this particular story hit the major mainstream media. The Daily Mail was very, very quick to pick up on it. And naturally, that has been a huge embarrassment for the university in question, a huge embarrassment for the markers, and a real boost to the student who unfortunately had to go suffered at the hands of the university. If you cast your mind back to the David Miller case at Bristol University, that dragged on for months and months and months until mainstream media got involved. It was mainly the pro-Israel groups such as Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. I think the Board of Deputies may have got involved. I think UK Lawyers for Israel may have got involved in that one as well. But it took months and months and months until Bristol University finally did the right thing, and I think they sacked Mr. Miller. Before that came to light. This case, I was again pleasantly surprised at the speed of which it happened. Unfortunately, I fear that cases like this are all too familiar in academia and around the British university system at the moment, which are putting Jewish students at a distinct disadvantage, not only from the daily anti-Semitism they're facing on campus, but not so subtle issues like this, where they're being penalised for being pro-Israel and perhaps even being Jewish.
And it's also for actually writing the truth. I mean, she said she was given a fail on one of her sociology assignments because she did not criticize Israel. She actually talked about how Hamas were committing crimes against the Palestinian people because they were using women and children as human shields, which is exactly the case. So is the whole question now of academic freedom of expression under threat unless you have only one narrative, and that's the pro-Hamas Palestinian narrative we're seeing at so many of our liberal universities across the country?
Well, academia, Simon, are simply following in the footsteps of mainstream media, where there's only been one narrative. Now, in this particular case, because it's got because there's been a complaint, and it's going through the legal process, there is a chance, albeit in my opinion, a small chance, and I'll come on to explain that in a minute, that this university will be exposed for bias paralleled by sheer ignorance. Now, the markers, one of the markers' names has been exposed, and I'm hoping that if this legal case is successful, then the university will have no other option than to deal with the markers in question as Bristol University had to deal with Professor Miller, and indeed as Keir Starmer had to deal with some people such as Chris Williamson. So yes, but one thing that I must emphasise, Simon, going back to where I'm not so don't have such confidence, is in order to win this case legally, and I've been speaking to fairly senior lawyers about this, the student in question has got to jump some pretty high hurdles. There's a pretty high bar for the law to come down as we would want it to in this particular case on the university. We're hoping it does so, but there's a pretty high threshold to cross. And it may be that the student, if she does lose this case, nevertheless has brought it to the forefront, and I don't think mainstream media will be shy in coming forward for similar cases. But going back to your question, has she been penalised for telling the truth? Absolutely, it would seem. But this is just an extension, in my opinion, of what's been happening over the last 3 or 4 decades when it comes to the false narratives surrounding the Israel-Palestinian issue.
And Peter, when I was at the University of Manchester, I was always under the impression, but I obviously found that this wasn't the case when I was at university as well, that if you provide an alternative argument and you back that up with facts, that is seen as academically being credible. And in this case, all she did was not actually really defend Israel, but what she did was told the truth of how Hamas, who is an Islamist, as we all know, a Palestinian terrorist organization that is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and effectively they are running a totalitarian regime in Gaza, where they are oppressing human rights of ordinary Arabs living in Gaza. So just to make that narrative and say that we're going to fail you because you didn't criticize Israel, Now, surely her argument was really about how the Palestinians are suffering under Hamas. So surely the lecturer who was ever marking her paper and failed her degree because of it, clearly was showing their academic bias, as it were, by favouring the Palestinians and not even addressing the real issue of what is a major issue in the Middle East today.
You're totally right, Simon, and there's not a lot for me to add from what you said. This is not a reflection of the students' competencies, because clearly from her previous marks, she is indeed a very knowledgeable person, and her previous results would show that. This is more of a reflection and exposes the bias and bigotry and ignorance of the marker or markers in question. That's what it reflects. And one would hope, even if the student fails in her legal attempts to win this case, and we're hoping that she does not for obvious reasons, there should be some repercussions on the person and persons who have failed this student for exposing their personal bigotry about this. This must stop, and naturally we're delighted that mainstream media has run with it. Now, going back to Hamas, if the markers were not bigoted, then, and we can prove this because they would have looked at the charters, the Hamas charters, which call for the elimination of the State of Israel. It calls for the extermination of Jewish people. And if anyone cares to view the charters, in Articles 17, 22 and 28 of the Hamas charters, unbelievably, Simon, they follow a Nazi agenda by demanding, and I kid you not, and anyone can read the Hamas Charter 1988, Articles 17, 22 and 28, call for the extermination of those people working directly for or indirectly for certain charities that are assisting, for example, the terminally ill or the mentally and physically disabled, refugees worldwide, people who have to go to food banks, etc. These are in the Hamas charters, which is following obviously the Muslim Brotherhood, but also tries to replicate a Nazi ideology. Now, if the markers had any knowledge, sympathy with morally decent, had any knowledge of the Hamas charters, had any sympathy with morally decent individuals, if they were morally decent themselves, then they could not have possibly have identified Hamas as being a freedom-fighting organization just doing its bit for ordinary Palestinian folk. We know that this is a false narrative that has managed to gain credibility within the media because of mainly the BBC's bias, one has to say about this, and the staff that they have that have been reporting on the Middle East conflict for the last 30 years. And unfortunately, ordinary folk who aren't as knowledgeable on the issue as you and perhaps people like myself who daily study this have come to believe this false narrative.
And Peter, what were your thoughts on Danielle Grayman? She's only 23. She describes her situation after being refused any accreditation or marks for the essay she wrote, which she got nothing for. She had to resit the assignment again. She passed it that time, but then was too late and missed out on a place of doing a master's at Glasgow University. She said that she wanted to be a sociologist, but after this episode brought her to meltdown. Just show the bravery and the courage that she's shown to pick herself up and actually then to pursue Leeds University with a law case and actually sue them. That shows incredible bravery. Not only is she standing up for herself, but she's standing up for the Jewish community and all those who love academic freedom of truth and love Israel.
you're absolutely right, and one can only try to understand the emotional trauma that this woman has suffered during this period. But you know something, Simon, something tells me that this kid's going to be okay, irrespective of whether she is successful in winning the legal case. And I say that with caveats because, having spoken to some very senior lawyers, there are some very high hurdles to cross on this. But even if she fails, and we pray to God that she doesn't in this legal situation, something tells me that she is going to have enough support out there because of the stand she's taking against what is clear bias and bigotry. And let's face it, at the end of the day, it's just bloody anti-Semitism. Excuse my language.
Absolutely. So, Peter, finally, if we look at this whole situation, and doesn't this open up a more worrying trend that our universities are heading in? That because of their left-wing bias, because of their hatred for Israel, academic freedom of expression is now under threat. We also know that many of our universities, particularly Middle Eastern departments, are influenced heavily by totalitarian regimes in the Middle East, such as the Iranians or even the Saudis or others, sponsors huge amounts of money to our universities to take a pro-Islamist agenda when it comes to talking about these issues relating to the Middle East. And then the danger is the truth gets chucked out with the baby gets chucked out with the bathwater, and then we also see a huge rise of anti-Semitism across our university campuses, which sadly we're seeing today. What is the danger if she loses this case and universities don't get their act together regarding this threat to academic freedom of expression by not allowing a different viewpoint, i.e. a viewpoint that actually tells the truth about Israel and the Palestinians?
Okay, now because of the situation that happened in Bristol University with David Miller, I'm pretty certain that governing boards at our major universities are going to think twice before they allow such academic misbehaviour to occur. Now, they can't stop it, but I think they will, because of the Bristol University situation, I think that has been a win for those of us who are trying to fight back against the false narrative and anti-Semitism. I would like to think, in this particular case again, that this is just a minor, how can I put it? That this won't be the norm going forward, that again, universities will think twice before copying what the markers of Bristol at Leeds University are doing. The more that we can expose these situations, the more that we can ensure that universities are kept on their toes. I hope this particular student gets the backing of the university, the Students' Union. I've yet to see anyone in the Students' Union hierarchy come out in support of her, and I'd like to see that happen as well.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us on Behind Headlines. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. God bless.
It's great. He makes so many good points there, doesn't he? And the bias that's in universities is part of the media system. That's why, we were talking about this earlier, how important it is for us in the media to actually challenge these views that are becoming accepted. And it's not just in the media, it's as much in the political realm. Because I know I've spoken to politicians about the charter of the Palestinian Authority, and they have no clue.
Do you mean the Hamas charter?
Yeah, yes. They have no clue about those things that Peter has just been referring to. It's it's actually the uprising of the Nazi thinking, and their charter is so much about removing the Jews from the face of the earth. So yeah, he makes so many very good points, and hopefully those people who are watching this program actually get motivated into challenging some of the things that we sometimes, I think we can be a little bit apathetic. We just accept. Maybe we think we can't make a difference, but you can. I know I've spoken with politicians who say the reason we have to allow certain things is because we get more mail coming against Israel than there's coming for Israel. But that doesn't excuse them doing the wrong thing for the wrong reason.
Of course.
But it's very important for us in the media, but also us as individuals, to challenge the lies, because we recognize their lies, and if we don't call it out, no one else is going to.
Yeah, I just want to pick up point as well. Another point regarding the Fatah Charter, which is the ruling faction of the PLO. They refuse to recognise Israel's right to exist, even though they made so-called peace with Israel. They don't recognise Israel as a Jewish state either. So how they can possibly make peace with Israel when they don't even recognise that Israel is a Jewish state? They don't recognise that Israel has a right to any of that territory. So therefore it's impossible. So that's the kind of main difference between the PLO Charter and that of Hamas, which is more genocidal. But the same, I mean, they're cooperating, they believe in the same ideals. They want destruction of the entire Jewish state of Israel, and that's what they're looking for. But of course, we are down to the last few minutes of the program, and my particular heart goes out to young Christians who are at university. I encourage you to stand by your biblical convictions, but also to reach out in friendship to Israel and the Jewish community. As when I was at university, I was so disillusioned with the Christian Union and their teaching on church replacement theology. I got involved with the Jewish Union, JSOC, and it was amazing to be around the Jewish people, seeing maps of Israel, talking about Israel all the time. And I said, the Lord's put this passion and love for Israel, but I can't even talk this with any Christians who have any understanding of this around my own age. So for me, that's where my journey began of my real love for Israel and having Jewish friends and going to Israel started at university. So you know, if you are at university, can I just encourage you to reach out to the Jewish community that feel, students in particular, feel under siege.
And as Peter just said on that clip earlier, for this young lady, Danielle, you know, we really do pray that when everything comes to the surface, they will rule in favor of her. As he says, she will be fine because she's taken on that fight, and she will keep her convictions, I'm sure. But she's one of many in the Jewish community, as you say, who come under so much hostility, and it's violent hostility. It's not just verbal. We've seen cases of them actually being attacked physically. And we need to be like our churches now, just praying for our Jewish community in university, but for our own kids, our young people who are going through university, that they remain in the truth and keep their faith strong and stand with those people who are being persecuted, and the Jews are right there in the midst of it all.
I mean, I think there's a big question, big moral question that comes out of today's programme, Alistair, and that is, don't compromise. Don't compromise with the truth. Stand on the truth. And as Jesus said, the truth will set you free, because it's God that will vindicate you. Clearly, with this very liberal left-wing marker of the assignment, this lecturer holds deeply anti-Israel views, but to actually threaten someone and give them kind of naught for their assignment so that they fail their graduation course, they've spent all that money to do the course, they've taken out loans to be able to do it, and they think they can then get a better qualification that leads to a better career. So he's saying you don't hold the right views on Israel, therefore I'm going to threaten your life chances, is disgraceful. Alistair, thank you so much for being my guest for Behind the Headlines. It's great to be doing a programme with you, and I want to thank you for watching at home. We've got to pray for our Christian students at universities and also Jewish students as well, because there's a real battle on campus, a battle for truth, a battle for Israel, and of course, as a as a direct result of this anti-Israel bias, we're seeing a big increase in anti-Semitism. It's not good for society, it's not good for the nation, and it's not good for Western civilization. That's why we've got to stand up against it. So thank you for watching tonight's pre-recorded Behind the Headlines.